Okay, so in terms of the literary devices that she uses, they're actually quite minimal and not entirely consistent, obviously because this is a series of stories that make a collection rather than one coherent piece of writing that's meant to connect really neatly throughout. We don't have consistent motifs, rather some of the stories have a motif of their own, usually a titular motif in the sense that the title is the motif that's run throughout, such as White Sparrow. So metaphor, describing something as something else, so something is or as that thing. Simile is something is like something else. So personification is giving human attributes, emotions or feelings to a whole range of things. She doesn't use this technique that often, but when she does it's quite noticeable. She also does pathetic fallacy, which is one subset of personification, and that's essentially giving human emotions to mostly natural events or objects. So I've got here foreshadowing, which doesn't really cover it. Obviously in a short story there's a whole range of different ways that you either foreshadow an event, or you don't mention an event, or you allude to an event, depending on whether you want to call it a hook or foreshadowing or whatever. Foreshadowing means that you're hinting at something that will happen. Quite often she does a whole range of hooks that may never be referred to, like, until before the accident or after he left, and not even naming the character. So there's a whole range of complicated ways that she does this, and they don't all necessarily have unique names in and of themselves, but these are the kind of plot devices and kind of ways of mentioning things that you'll be focusing on in your own short story piece. You really have a short amount of time to draw the people in and get them hooked in, finding out what happens at the end of your very short passage. There's a couple of intertextual references, so this is basically when one text, this book, references another text or another series of texts. Could be a movie, TV show, book, magazine, anything really that takes you from one text and makes a connection to another text. While intertext is exactly that, so it's those texts directly quoted or sampled within the story. So there's one particular story that has a little nursery rhyme section in it that's all italicized, and that would be a really good example of intertext. So using someone else's text to kind of cut up and provide examples for your own text. The most obvious one would be the quote at the very front of the book. That's a very clear and distinct way of using intertext. So she's providing someone else's quote to sort of set up her own story. Imagery is a massive one, and anytime you use the word imagery, besides this context I guess, you sort of want to have an adjective in front of it. So you want to say something like spiritual imagery or dark imagery or natural imagery, but in this case she used a whole different range of imagery. The stories are very rich in irony, so obviously saying the opposite to what you mean, or people being ironic in their dialogue, that's a very Australian trait, so she uses that and colloquialism to make it very clearly an Australian story. To go along with the irony and the colloquialism is of course humour, and all these three are very human and especially Australian characteristics and ways of speaking and ways of telling stories that you'll try and tap into your own writing. Lastly, symbolism and motif. So symbolism, you're thinking something that's localised to a certain area. So certain characters symbolise certain things within Australia, and a motif is the same thing as a symbol but something that reoccurs throughout a story. It's hard to say really if a motif applies in such short stories, but if you've got something that's in the title that's then echoed all through the story, then it's best to call that a motif, and you might choose to have a motif of your own to flow through the story that is both symbolic and something that ties the deeper meaning of your story together. Alright, so that's a really good synopsis of the sort of technical elements that make up the stories and the ways that you're going to have to the things that you're going to have to understand. Firstly, you'll then secondly locate within the text, and then thirdly recreate in your own text. So I hope this has given you a lot of ideas of how to plan out your own story, how to locate certain elements, and how to, once you've picked a story, how to pull out these pieces of information and this meta language that I've provided you and then reproduce it in your own story.